I'm not proud of the person I used to be back then. I spent most of my life drifting from town to town, surviving however I could. Trouble followed me everywhere. I stole cars, got into fights, and made money in ways I don't even like thinking about now. Eventually, I came up with a scam that worked far too well. Every few nights, I'd drive into a small town nobody cared about. The kind of place with empty roads, old gas stations, and houses sitting miles apart. I would spend hours looking for the perfect target, elderly couples who seemed isolated and vulnerable. My trick was simple. Around 9 o'clock at night, I'd pull my car onto the side of the road near their house and pretend it had broken down. Then I'd rush to the door, acting panicked, telling them my pregnant wife was in the hospital and I desperately needed a phone. Almost every time they let me inside without hesitation. Once inside, I would tie them up, steal valuables, and leave before anyone noticed. I never planned on hurting anybody. In my mind, that somehow made me less awful. Then came the night that changed everything. I found a house sitting alone on a narrow country road. No nearby neighbors. Thick woods stretched endlessly behind the property. It looked perfect, easy out. I parked near the road and walked up to the porch. When I knocked, an elderly woman answered. But instead of looking worried or confused, she smiled at me calmly. Too calmly. I launched into my act anyway. She stared at me for a few seconds before placing a cold hand on my shoulder. "Oh, honey," she whispered. "Come inside. We'll help you." The moment I stepped into the house, something felt wrong. The air smelled terrible. Not like garbage or body odor. Worse, heavy and rotten. I tried ignoring it while the woman guided me into the living room. Then I heard heavy footsteps. A massive man stepped into the room, carrying a hunting rifle. He looked no older than 30. Towering over me with a thick black beard and broad shoulders, he stared without blinking. My stomach dropped instantly. This wasn't some helpless old couple. The woman smiled wider. "That's my son," she said. "He'll go check your car." Panic hit me hard. The son would realize immediately that my car worked perfectly. Before I could think of an excuse, the woman began shouting for her husband. An older man limped into the room slowly. He looked exhausted, but his eyes locked onto me in a way that made my skin crawl. Nobody spoke. They just stared. That awful smell seemed stronger now. I started backing toward the door, carefully mumbling that I needed something from my car. The old woman stepped closer. "Leaving already?" she asked softly. The husband moved to blocking part of the doorway. That was enough for me. I suddenly sprinted for the exit. Someone grabbed at my jacket, but I tore free and ran outside. My heart was hammering as I rushed toward my car and froze. All 4 tires had been slashed. Not flattened, slashed. From the house, I heard the old man yell, "He's outside." I looked around wildly, but couldn't see the sun anywhere. Fear took over completely. I bolted toward the woods behind the house, branches whipping against my face as I ran deeper into the darkness. After several minutes, I dropped behind a large tree and held my breath. Then I heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps crunching slowly through the leaves. Closer. Closer. I peeked beside the tree and nearly stopped breathing entirely. The sun was only a few feet away. In the moonlight, I could see him smiling to himself like he was enjoying a game. And then I realized something even worse. He wasn't searching randomly anymore. He was walking directly toward my hiding spot. As the footsteps stopped beside the tree, I realized the man with the rifle might have known where I was the entire time. I stayed completely still behind that tree, barely breathing. The huge man stood only a few feet away now, the barrel of his hunting rifle hanging loosely at his side. I could hear him breathing heavily through the silence of the woods. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I knew the second I moved he'd hear me. For several long seconds he didn't move at all. Then he laughed quietly. Not a normal laugh either. It sounded low and almost excited, like he was enjoying every second of this. My hands started shaking uncontrollably. I pressed myself harder against the tree trunk, trying to disappear into the darkness. The woods were freezing cold, but sweat poured down my neck. The man suddenly turned his head slightly, almost as if listening for something deeper in the forest. That's when I heard it too. Another set of footsteps. Slow, dragging, coming from farther back in the woods. At first I thought it was the old man from the house, but these footsteps sounded different, uneven. Wet somehow. The large man straightened up immediately. Then he spoke quietly into the darkness. "You're scaring him," I froze. He wasn't talking to me. Something moved between the trees farther ahead. I couldn't make out a person clearly, only a shape standing unnaturally still in the dark. My eyes struggled to focus on it. The man with the rifle chuckled again. "You should have stayed inside," he muttered. Suddenly the figure moved fast. Way too fast, it darted behind another tree, disappearing completely. I heard branches snapping deeper in the woods. Now circling around us, even the giant man looked tense. Suddenly, he lifted the rifle and scanned the darkness carefully. That was my chance. While he focused on whatever was moving out there, I slowly crawled backward through the leaves, trying not to make a sound. Every inch felt painfully slow. Then my elbow snapped a small twig. The man whipped around instantly. "There you are," he growled. I jumped up and ran. I crashed through the woods blindly, hearing heavy footsteps pounding behind me. Branches tore at my face while my lungs burned. I didn't know where I was going anymore. I just needed distance. Then I heard something else running too. Not behind me, beside me. Something was keeping pace through the trees. I risked a glance to my right and nearly screamed. For half a second, I saw a thin figure sprinting between the trees. It looked human, but wrong somehow. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like its limbs bent awkwardly while running. Then it vanished again into the darkness. The man behind me shouted angrily. But I wasn't sure anymore whether he was yelling at me. I kept running until I finally saw the road ahead. My car sat crooked near the house with its ruined tires. The porch light glowed weakly, while the old woman stood motionless in the doorway, watching. Even from that distance, I could tell she was smiling. I didn't stop moving. I ran past my car and straight down the road. Behind me, I heard yelling coming from the woods, followed by one loud gunshot that echoed through the night. I almost collapsed from exhaustion, but adrenaline kept me going. After what felt like forever, I reached the edge of town and found an all-night gas station. I burst inside looking like a maniac. The cashier stared at me in shock. "You okay, buddy?" I turned to look through the windows, toward the empty road behind me. Nobody was there, no. I whispered, "I really don't think I am." The cashier let me use the phone, and eventually I paid to get my car towed the next morning. I never told the police what happened. I didn't want questions about why I'd been there in the first place. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shape moving through the woods. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. A month later, I drove back to that road during the daytime. I told myself I only wanted proof that none of it was real. But when I reached the property, the house was gone, not abandoned. Gone. The land was empty except for a cracked concrete foundation and burnt pieces of wood scattered everywhere. It looked like the house had burned down years ago. An older man working near the road noticed me staring. "You knew the family that lived there?" he asked. I shook my head carefully. What happened to them? The man looked uncomfortable. Immediately. Place caught fire, he said quietly. Long time ago. Whole family died. A cold feeling spread through my chest. What family? The man frowned. Old couple. Their son too. He paused. Shame what happened to those hikers, though. I stared at him. Hikers. He nodded slowly. Couple people disappeared in those woods before the fire. Folks around here always thought that family had something to do with it. I couldn't speak because I had seen them. All three of them. Alive, and suddenly, I remembered the fourth figure moving between the trees that night. The one the giant man had spoken to. The one that definitely wasn't human. Years later, I thought I had escaped that nightmare forever, until someone knocked on my apartment door holding a single yellow flower. For years I convinced myself that night in the woods never really happened. I told myself exhaustion and paranoia had twisted my memories. Maybe the house had belonged to another family before the fire. Maybe the old man at the gas station got the details wrong. Maybe the thing I saw running through the woods was just another person. Anything sounded better than the truth. Eventually, life moved on. I stopped pulling robberies and drifted into quieter work. Nothing glamorous. Mostly warehouse jobs and overnight shifts, where nobody asked questions. I stayed out of trouble for the most part, though I was still far from a good person. But no matter how much time passed, I never forgot that family. Especially the old woman's smile. Almost 12 years later, I was living alone in a tiny apartment outside a small city. My routine was painfully boring: work, sleep, repeat. Honestly, I preferred it that way. Quiet felt safe. Then one night around 11:30, someone knocked on my apartment door. 3 slow knocks. I remember feeling annoyed more than scared at first. My apartment building was old and drunk. Neighbors constantly wandered the halls. At night, I walked over and looked through the peephole. Nobody was there. I almost laughed to myself. Until I noticed something sitting on the floor outside my door. A single yellow flower. My stomach tightened immediately. I opened the door carefully and looked down the hallway. Empty. The flower looked freshly picked. Wrapped around the stem was a thin strip of paper, folded neatly. My hands were already shaking before I opened it. The note contained only 4 words. You ran too far. I slammed the door shut instantly. For several minutes, I just stood there staring at the paper in disbelief. I hadn't told anyone that story. Not friends. Not coworkers. Nobody. I kept telling myself it had to be a coincidence. But deep down I knew it wasn't. That yellow flower triggered a memory I hadn't thought about in years. When I visited the burned-down property long ago, I remembered wild yellow flowers growing near the edge of the woods. The same flowers the old woman used to keep, in tiny pots near the porch. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I threw the flower and note into a dumpster several blocks away before heading to work. I tried forcing myself to move on like nothing happened. Then things got worse. 2 nights later, I returned home after work and found my apartment unlocked. I was positive I had locked it before leaving. Every light inside was off. My heart pounded as I stepped inside slowly. Nothing looked stolen. Nothing looked damaged. Then I noticed the smell. That same rotten smell from the farmhouse. I nearly gagged. The odor seemed stronger near the kitchen. I walked carefully toward it and froze completely. Sitting on the table was an old photograph. Black and white. Worn at the edges. It showed the farmhouse before the fire. The old woman stood on the porch smiling. Beside her stood the old man. And next to them was the massive son, holding his rifle. Someone had scratched over all 3 of their faces. My chest tightened when I realized there was writing on the back. I flipped it over carefully. We never left. I grabbed my keys immediately and ran from the apartment. I spent the entire night driving around aimlessly, too terrified to go back inside. Around dawn, exhaustion finally forced me into a cheap roadside motel outside town. I kept the TV on all night just to avoid silence. The next morning, I decided to call the county, where the farmhouse used to be. I didn't even know what I planned to ask. Maybe I just needed reassurance that those people were dead. An older woman answered at the sheriff's office. I asked carefully if there had ever been a fire involving a family living on an isolated road outside town. There was a long pause. Then she asked, "Who's asking?" Something about her tone made me uncomfortable. Immediately, "I'm just curious," I said. Another pause. Finally, she replied quietly, "That property should stay forgotten." Cold chills spread through my arms. Before I could ask anything else, she continued, "People still go missing around those woods sometimes." My mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" The woman lowered her voice. "They never found all the bodies after the fire." The line suddenly filled with static. Then I heard something faint underneath the noise. Breathing. Heavy breathing, followed by a familiar low laugh. I dropped the phone instantly. The motel room suddenly felt freezing cold. Slowly, I looked toward the window. Outside, across the parking lot, stood a tall figure beside an old pickup truck. Even from that distance, I recognized the beard. And beside him stood an elderly woman. Both of them were staring directly at my room. I thought escaping the motel would save me, until I discovered someone had already been waiting inside my apartment the entire time the second I saw them. Standing across the motel parking lot, every part of me locked up. The old woman stood perfectly still beside the pickup truck, clutching that yellow flower in her hands. The huge bearded man towered beside her, with his head tilted slightly forward, staring directly at my motel room window. Neither of them moved. Neither of them blinked. For a moment, I genuinely wondered if I was losing my mind. Then the old woman slowly raised one hand and waved it. That snapped me out of it. I grabbed my keys, rushed out the motel room door, and practically fell down the stairs trying to get to my car. My hand shook so badly I dropped my keys twice, before finally unlocking the door. When I looked back toward the truck, they were gone. The parking space sat empty. No truck. No people. Nothing. I didn't stay to think about it. I peeled out of the parking lot immediately and drove straight back toward the city. My only plan was to grab my belongings from the apartment and disappear somewhere else for a while. During the entire drive, I kept checking my mirrors. Every dark-colored truck made my chest tighten. By the time I reached my apartment building, the sun was starting to rise. The parking lot looked normal. Quiet. Safe. I almost convinced myself again that maybe exhaustion had finally broken my brain. Then I noticed my apartment door slightly open. Just a crack. I stopped cold in the hallway. I knew for a fact I had locked it before leaving. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave, but all my money, clothes, and important documents were still inside. I told myself maybe the landlord entered for maintenance or something harmless like that. Still, my heart pounded violently as I pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, completely silent. At first glance, nothing looked disturbed. But then I noticed muddy footprints leading from the front door into the hallway. Large footprints. I followed them slowly toward the kitchen. That smell hit me again immediately. Rotten. Heavy. Wrong. The kitchen light was on now. And sitting on the counter was another note. This time the handwriting looked rougher, almost angry. You shouldn't have come back. Next to the note sat an old cassette tape recorder. The tiny red light was blinking. Recording. I stared at it for several seconds before forcing myself to press stop. Then play. At first there was only static. Then I heard movement. Footsteps inside my apartment. My breathing grew shallow as the tape continued. I heard my own front door opening and closing. Then silence. A few seconds later, a voice spoke softly into the recorder. An old woman's voice. "We found him again, my knees nearly gave out." Then another voice spoke. The huge man he smells scared now. A third voice suddenly interrupted them. Not human, I don't know how else to explain it. The voice sounded wet and broken, almost like several whispers layered together. I couldn't understand the words completely, but I heard one thing clearly downstairs. The tape abruptly stopped. I stood frozen in the kitchen, unable to breathe properly anymore. Then came the sound. A floorboard creaking from inside my apartment. Not the hallway. Not outside. Inside. Very slowly, I turned toward the dark hallway leading to my bedroom. Another creak followed. Someone was in there. Every survival instinct took over instantly. I bolted for the front door without looking back. Behind me, I heard sudden movement. I slammed the apartment door behind me and sprinted down the stairs. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding after me. From inside the building, I burst into the parking lot. Just as an apartment window above shattered loudly, glass rained down beside me. I looked up for one horrifying second. Something stood at my broken apartment window. Tall. Thin. Its body looked twisted unnaturally as it leaned halfway outside. I couldn't see a clear face, only darkness where its features should have been. Then it smiled. Not a human smile. Too wide. I jumped into my car and sped out of the parking lot, while my tires screeched across the pavement. I didn't stop driving for nearly 3 hours. Eventually, I ended up at my parents' house. I hadn't spoken to them much in years, but I didn't care anymore. I needed somewhere safe. I told them someone had broken into my apartment, and I didn't feel comfortable staying there anymore. I left out the rest because I knew how insane it sounded. For the first time in years, I actually slept. But sometime around 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke suddenly to voices downstairs. Quiet voices. I sat up slowly in bed, listening carefully. At first, I thought my parents were awake. Then I heard my mother scream. I jumped out of bed and ran toward the stairs. And halfway down, I froze. The front door stood wide open. Mud covered the floor. Yellow flowers had been scattered all through the living room. And standing in the kitchen, smiling directly at me, was the old woman from the farmhouse. When the old woman smiled at me inside my parents' house, I finally realized the horrifying truth about what had followed me out of those woods all those years ago. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. The old woman stood in my parents' kitchen, exactly the way I remembered her from all those years ago. Same thin gray hair, same hollow eyes, same unsettling smile with barely any teeth showing. Yellow flowers were scattered across the floor. Around her feet, my mother was crying somewhere behind the kitchen island, while my father stood frozen near the sink, clutching a baseball bat with shaking hands. The old woman looked at me like she'd been expecting this reunion for a very long time. "You took your time," she whispered. Every survival instinct screamed at me to run, but this was my parents' house. I couldn't just leave them there. "Who are you?" I shouted. The woman tilted her head slightly, almost confused by the question. "You already know us," behind her. I noticed muddy footprints leading deeper into the house. My stomach tightened immediately. The huge sun was here too. Maybe something else as well. My father stepped forward nervously with the bat raised. "Get out of my house," the woman's smile slowly faded. Then she looked toward the dark hallway behind me and softly said, "Bring him down." The temperature in the house suddenly felt ice cold. Heavy footsteps echoed upstairs. My blood turned to ice. Something was up there without thinking. I shoved my father backward and yelled for my parents to get outside. My mother ran immediately, but my father hesitated. Then the upstairs bedroom door slammed open violently. The entire house shook. Those same heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway above us. Ceiling dust drifted down while something moved impossibly fast upstairs. The old woman still hadn't moved from the kitchen. She simply watched me calmly, and then I heard another sound dragging. Coming from behind me, I turned slowly toward the dark hallway near the staircase. Something tall stood there. At first, it barely looked human at all. Its arms hung too long. Its body bent awkwardly sideways, like broken bones had healed incorrectly. Most horrifying was its face, or whatever remained of it. Its skin looked dark and wet, stretched tightly over something unnatural underneath, and it was smiling. That same impossibly wide smile I'd seen at my apartment window. My father finally dropped the bat and ran for the front door. I grabbed him and practically shoved both my parents outside while screaming at them to get in the car and leave. The old woman began laughing softly behind us. Not loud, not angry, almost affectionate, as if this entire thing amused her. I turned back one final time before leaving. The tall creature stood motionless near the stairs, while the massive bearded son emerged behind, holding the rifle loosely in one hand. Then I noticed something horrifying. His face looked wrong now too. Paler, sunken, like he'd been dead for years. The old woman looked directly into my eyes. "You were supposed to stay," she whispered. Then every light in the house exploded at once. Glass burst outward. My parents screamed outside, while the entire house plunged into darkness that finally broke me completely. I ran. I threw my parents into the car and sped away from the house faster than I thought possible. My mother cried the entire drive, while my father sat silently, staring out the window in shock. None of us spoke about what we saw. Not that night. Not ever. The next morning, we returned to the house with police officers. There was nobody there. No signs of forced entry. No footprints. No broken lights. Nothing. The police clearly thought we were insane. But I know what we saw, and things became even worse. A few days later, one of the officers pulled me aside privately after hearing where all this supposedly started. When I mentioned the isolated farmhouse road, he asked me to wait there. A few minutes later, he returned, carrying an old photograph from some kind of file folder. This family, he asked carefully. It was them. The old couple and their son. Same faces. Same smiles. My hands started shaking immediately. The officer studied me closely before speaking again. That family disappeared almost 30 years ago, he said quietly. I stared at him. Disappeared. He nodded slowly. The house burned down after several missing persons investigations connected to the property. Police believed the family fled before they could be arrested. Cold chill spread through my entire body. "That's impossible," I whispered. The officer frowned. Why? Because I had seen them recently. Not 30 years ago, not in old photographs. I saw them standing in my parents' kitchen only days earlier. The officer lowered his voice slightly. There's one more thing, he pulled out, another photo. This one showed several officers standing near the burned remains of the farmhouse. Decades ago, at first it looked normal. Then I noticed something in the trees behind them. A tall figure. Thin. Watching. Exactly like the thing I'd seen in my apartment, in my parents' house. The officer pointed toward it carefully. "We never identified that person," he said. I couldn't speak anymore. Because suddenly I understood the truth. That family hadn't been haunting those woods. Something in those woods had found them first. And after all these years, it finally found me too. Even now, I still check every dark window at night. Because sometimes I catch the reflection of an old woman smiling behind me holding a single yellow flower.